A city is only as good as the quality of life for its poorest citizens.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. This week we're talking about city planning in Toronto, and my guests are three people who are intimately connected with this subject. Blair Scorgie, a alumnus of this podcast, Adam Brind, a broker for real estate in Toronto, and Pamela Robinson, associate professor at Ryerson University. Now, we talk about a lot of things in this particular episode. Housing affordability is probably one of the big themes that cuts through every single thing that we talk about. It's an important subject in Toronto, but in any city. And with that comes, of course, sprawl. Engagement and democracy is something that we can't help avoid talking about. Urbanization in the era of technology, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, and how they may transform the landscape of the city. How city design changes social reality. The role of government. The increasing polarization and stratification of our society that is evident in the way that we are building our cities. And of course, the death of distance as a result of technology. All of this is coming up in this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Now, if you like this podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. And of course, you can go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. Let me know what you think of the show. Send me an email. Give me your feedback on this episode or any other. And reach out on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. I look forward to hearing from you. Okay, Adam Brind, Blair Scorgie, Pamela Robinson, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk to you guys about the city, the future of the city, what it means to live in a city today. We are in Toronto, which I think is an appropriate place to talk about this, and with three people who I think have a lot to say about the subject. So before we get to the first question, which is, of course, What on Earth is Going On, the name of the podcast, I want to go one at a time and just have you briefly introduce yourself and where you come from, what you do, that kind of thing. So Blair, why don't you go first?
Okay, so my name is Blair Scorgie. I'm Director of Business Development at a company called SvN Architects and Planners. We're a consulting firm in Toronto, and I'm a contract lecturer here at Ryerson University.
And you're an alumnus of the podcast.
I'm an alumnus of the podcast. That's right.
You and I did an episode on urban planning and design some months ago, which was really, really interesting. And I've actually got a lot of good feedback about it. Some of the things that I've heard since we did that conversation, I might reincorporate into this one. So cool. Adam.
Yeah, so I am a broker record and managing partner at Core Assets Real Estate. We're a boutique firm downtown Toronto. We've been in operation for coming on 7 years now. We do a large part of our business is in the condo market and new construction market and infill construction as well in the city. And so we see a lot of the growth happening here.
Excellent. Pamela.
Hi, I'm Pamela Robinson. I'm an associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson, and I'm a registered professional planner like Blair. I've been teaching planning here since 2005, and my area of research focuses on weird things from the future and what it means for cities.
Excellent. And Pamela, you're also the provider of our room today, so thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. The School of Urban and Regional Planning is super happy you're all here. So, yeah.
So first question, Blair. Well, let's just get to it. It's a deliberately broad question for a deliberately broad response. So what on earth is going on?
Oh, man, so much stuff is going on. I guess in our office right now, we're doing a lot of work that operates at the intersection of mobility and housing. Those are sort of the two main focuses of our work. And you and I touched on some of that a little bit the last time we met. Specifically right now, we're doing a lot of work with developers in partnership with transit authorities like Metrolinx, for instance, in looking at developing on top of station sites and corridors, like transit corridors. So we're working on a site right now with Metrolinx and a private land developer for the relocated Mimico GO station. We're actually looking at developing the station as well as the land on top of it and introducing active transportation facilities around that land, which is kind of interesting. And now we're sort of speaking with Metrolinx and GO about potentially applying that same logic to several other different sites. And we're also sort of now talking to the TTC about some potential opportunities for, we call it development over transit. And I'm also doing a lot of work just sort of more broadly in the housing area. I'm working with municipalities, sort of fringe municipalities in the GTA, looking at, so I've got a couple studies underway right now where we're doing like a municipal review of official plan land use policies for housing, for neighborhoods, and looking at ways that we can introduce, new uses and new building typologies that haven't been built actually in quite a long time, but are part of a broader solution of trying to address the housing supply issue, the housing affordability issue, without the need to continuously grow outwards. So that's a lot of the stuff that I'm kind of doing, is focusing on those two things.
Excellent. And one thing that we talked about in our conversation was engagement and the importance of, and that the relevance actually of democracy in urban planning, and how people not only participate but have their voices heard, and how governments and corporations and institutions respond to people, whether they are actively saying something or whether they're passively making their voices heard, say through the money that they spend, where they spend it, where they walk somewhere. And I think Toronto's a really interesting place for that discussion, with a lot of technological work that's being done. I think is it Sidewalk Labs, is that right? Who are doing some really interesting and controversial stuff in this city, and handing over some of the usual tools that government uses to a corporation to make these decisions. And I think that might come up in our conversation. Pamela's nodding, so I think she wants to address that. Adam, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of talk from the ground level. What we do is we're in the residential real estate market here in Toronto, and I've been in it now for about a little over 11 years. Really seen the landscape change and kind of buyer demands in the last decade or so. It's been pretty phenomenal to see the people flooding back to the city that were once in the suburbs. But not only that, but the big corps. I mean, in my time alone, I've watched companies like Coca-Cola, put their headquarters back down, at King and Sherbourne, where once they were sort of on the outskirts in the suburbs where land was cheap and, people could commute to and have parking. But what we're finding is that, all the labor is down here, and so people want to live down here. They're putting value over their time versus a big mortgage. So they'll say, I'll pay for, a nice big condo or a nice big house and have the extra mortgage so that I don't have to commute 2 or 3 hours a day. What we're also seeing now is, where families didn't consider it before, we're seeing, whole families consider condo living, specifically in the downtown core. And that's sort of new to Toronto. I know it's always been big in London and New York per se. And condo developers are finally starting to catch on. They're finally saying, okay, you know what? It's time to not build the bachelor and single family or smaller ones, 500 square foot condos, even though those are most profitable and sell it fastest. They're realizing that, there is strong demand for those, 1,000, 1,200 square foot condos with 2 or 3 bedrooms, where a family could have, a baby or two kids. And, you're seeing that even in the school development in the downtown core, trying to make sure that we have the infrastructure for all these families coming downtown. We're seeing prices, sort of skyrocket in condos. And I don't see any end in sight. There's a lot of pundits out there that will say differently about what's happening in Toronto. But, from the ground level, when, a company like Amazon announces 600 jobs coming to Toronto, I see that, firsthand. I see, when one of my agents is working with a company like Shopify and, they're sort of become all millionaires overnight and looking for, super urban kind of cool space downtown. They need to find somewhere to live. And there's only so many single family homes, only so many semi-detached homes. And so they say, well, I want to be on the transit line. And, they're wealthy young professionals that just will not go outside of the city. They want to be close to home and they want to be close to the work.
Well, and there's another interesting aspect of this too, is that most people in Toronto, I mean in most cities, but especially Toronto, when they're buying a home, are looking at it as an investment. Yeah. I mean, they just know that this is not just where I'm going to live. This is what I'm going to be selling in 15 years or 5 years or 50 years or whatever. And that factors into so much of this decision making. The other seed that I wanted to drop into it now, maybe for later in the conversation, is this idea of obviously of urbanization and suburbanization and the moving back and forth, and how cities have evolved over the last 200 years, let alone since the Second World War. And Bill Gates, for example, said not too long ago that technology would reverse urbanization, that we would just go back out into the suburbs because we don't need to work in a big downtown office anymore. And now people are saying the same thing is going to happen as a result of autonomous vehicles, right? So if I don't have to drive my vehicle, I can just go to sleep in the back seat. This is maybe 10 years away, 20 years away. That could also reverse the trend. But there's another spirit here of the city, that people want to live where things are happening. It's a very human desire. Pamela, what on earth is going on?
So the comments you just made really land squarely in the middle of the work that I do, which is in the space between technology and planning. And I'm not a technology person, I'm a planner. But I happen to find myself right now as one of the only urban planners at tables focusing on issues around smart cities, around open government and open data conversations. So, for example, I sit on the Waterfront Toronto Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, which advises Waterfront Toronto on the technology that's being proposed to be put into use by Alphabet Google Sidewalk Labs on the Quayside project on Toronto's waterfront. So it's really interesting to be the only urban planner sitting around that table. There is a colleague, Charles Finley, who works at the IBI group, but he works in urban issues writ large, not just as a planner. Because my preoccupations are different than other people's interests, because technology looks interesting and fantastic in the abstract, but when it starts to land in a real place with real people, it suddenly takes on meaning that matters in a different way. And both the pros and the cons of that technology are much more real when you imagine it in an actual park that you can see with your eyes or that you've been through in your own way. So there's an interesting divide, I think, between technology and urbanism that we're trying to bring together. But there's a lot of work to be done, and certainly there's a lot of work for planners to do. And there's also work on the tech side for the technology folks to better understand that product development, which is the way things work in the technology side, isn't the same as city building. And you can't use the same language, you can't use the same processes. So there's a lot of mutual learning happening right now on a highly contentious project.
Pamela, what is a smart city?
That's a really good question. I think when we talk about smart cities in general in Canada, and the Canadian Smart Cities Challenge is underway right now as we're recording this. The finalists just submitted their proposals. There are 20 finalists. They just came in early first week of March, and so we'll have an answer by late May, I'm told, by the federal government. A smart city is one in which you use technology and data in service to problems that matter with the hope of creating a more livable current situation and a more sustainable and inclusive future. That's the ideal version of it. The reality of it is that we're seeing little bits of technology being experimented with in particular places. We're seeing things like autonomous connected vehicles being heralded as the great change in terms of patterns of urbanism and form. And Blair, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think, but I'm like, they're still cars. We've had cars in cities for a long time, so they're not that new. There are new things that come with them, but there are lots of interesting tensions between the marketing and hype around technology and what people like us think on the ground in terms of how that technology lands.
Blair, do you want to take a hack at that now that she's pointed you out?
My thoughts on autonomous vehicles?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I tend to think that as we've sort of mentioned here already, that people sort of rush to this as the solution to our problems, and I don't think anything at the end of the day will replace public transit. I don't think there's nor should it. Yeah. Nor should it. And we are. We may have, it may help to ease congestion. We may have vehicles traveling closer together, but we're still putting people in private vehicles, and we're still creating all the issues that come with that. And I think that's not the solution to our problems. Although I am sort of interested by autonomous vehicles, and not only autonomous vehicles, but the intersection between electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and shared mobility, which I think is kind of the bigger thing that's starting to happen. And there is a lot of opportunity there. So, if we can get people to a point where they don't need to have private vehicles at all, and they can, again, ideally public transit addresses the vast majority of our needs. But if we can get people to a point where they can hail an autonomous vehicle, share that ride with somebody else, share in the cost of that ride, and, it means that they don't need to have their own private vehicle, that we can start looking at reducing parking requirements in future developments. We can save a tremendous amount of money on the development side.
It can revolutionize what a city looks like and how you get around it, too.
Yeah.
And the structure of society. I was listening to a podcast earlier today about the history of the city in preparation for this conversation. Mm-hmm. And in the 19th century, when you had people like Haussmann who were rebuilding cities like Paris and totally changing how people lived, it was believed that they weren't just changing the structure of a city, they were changing the structure of society. And it was very clear that these changes were going to pass down through generations, and they have. In our conversation, Blair, we talked about the difference between Paris and London, mm-hmm. and how they've emerged differently. But there's the ground level to this too. And Adam, I wanted to ask you if you've seen any trends change in, say, the last 10, 15 years of what people are looking for when they want a home. So, for example, are people okay now to not have parking? Or do they insist on being close to public transport where they didn't before? Are they more okay with buses or still preferring trains? I mean, what have you noticed in trends?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always said this, that Toronto's sort of made up of a bunch of small towns. I mean, people say, okay, well, where should I live? And part of our job is to help them realize that Toronto is not one big city. It's like, multiple little towns and little villages and with their own shops and bakeries and people that live there. And, going back on your last statement, they're all planned differently. Like some are closer to the curb, some are set further back, some have laneway, and it all adds to the character. And I find that, yes, people are moving away from having vehicles in general. It's not as important, especially with the new condos that are coming up that don't have that same amenity. But certainly in the the semi and detached areas of the city, we're seeing people. It's always been more popular to be along this, like the subway and transit lines. They always sell for more, and they're always the first to go on multiple offers type thing. Yeah. And I don't think that will ever change. I think that's only going to increase. And what was interesting to see is like a town, for instance, I call it a town, but like a little section of Toronto, like Roncesvalles, develop over the last, say, 10 years, whereas once sort of a little Polish community has now become this hotbed of like creative and young professionals that have sort of migrated there because it's on the transit line, it's on the King Street transit line. And they've bought up these houses, and prices have sort of skyrocketed there because of that. But it's within 10-minute streetcar to downtown. Mm-hmm. It's got great walkability. It's got a lot of awesome stores very close to the big park, High Park. It's one of those little villages that when you go there, you get this sense of community the second that you drive down there, and with its own little main street. So I think as long as that keeps happening, I think.
That's where I live.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pamela.
I was going to say it's my neighborhood, and you've characterized it well. But what's interesting, though, is that, if you were able to get a place in Roncesvalles 15 years ago like we did, like it was still relatively affordable compared to the rest of the city. But now it's increasingly unaffordable. And so the neighborhood pattern and form and fabric is going to change because only a certain kind of people can afford to buy in now. And then you've got Parkdale, which is adjacent, and it's this really amazing, vibrant, diverse neighborhood that's under tremendous pressure in terms of economic change. And a really amazing group of people at the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust are trying to organize in a way that they can start to buy up private land assets and keep them in a public land trust as part of a way of staving off this great wave of change that continues to march west in Toronto, and that's displacing people. And so for all of the things that make Roncesvalles great, it's also an important cautionary tale about we need to make sure that we've got different kinds of places where all kinds of people can remain and live inside the city with good access to transit. And, I'm super encouraged by the work that Blair's firm SvN is doing, because building on top of transit nodes and mobility hubs, they're one of our last great assets left in the city. There isn't a lot of vacant land left. And so when government owns the land, and they've got the means to figure out what the pro forma looks like for the return on public investment in private development like the work you do, you can suddenly start to DJ and mix a different kind of city, right? You can hold fast and say, we are going to deliver actual affordable housing targets because we own the land. And you don't get to come and do this until we get the affordable housing that we need. And we need affordable housing as close to transit as possible because, the cost of moving around the region adds significantly. I mean, the cost of a second car could make a huge difference in terms of someone being available to get a mortgage or not, or just being able to afford to live in a better place. So that mix of housing, jobs, and accessibility to transit is really important. But the role of government in holding to delivering good public outcomes really matters too. And finding creative private sector partners to work with who are willing to partner in different ways also matters.
Mm-hmm. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, on that same note, I was just going to talk about, so I was at an economic summit the other day, and they were talking about sort of the deliveries that we have coming on board over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of condos. So it's roughly around, say, 30 to 40,000 per year, which is higher than normal. But our vacancy rate, they said our vacancy rate right now, today in March, is lower than Winnipeg, meaning that, the stuff that's coming on board is being absorbed so quickly. And I don't know how they're going to solve that problem, especially for the young professionals. I think the rent rates are going to continue to rise, and it's going to make it unaffordable. So you could see a reversal. The other thing that I would love to get your input. The other thing that I could see happening is a reversal is if crime rates increased in some of these areas. Which naturally happens when it's more populated, I guess. But But yeah, no, I mean, we see it every day on the ground, the struggles that young professionals have that are, making a good wage, $60,000, $80,000 a year, that can't afford a bachelor condo in the downtown core right now. And these deliveries don't seem to be helping the situation. And so how do we build, purpose-built buildings that, are, sort of rent controlled, where somebody can start their career and start their life and decide if Toronto's right for them? Because we see that too. People leave. People come and they say, this was great, had a great time, but it's time to go.
Right.
Yeah.
There's this question of the role of government, Pamela, that you raised, and there's a philosophical question that might precede it. So my question is, we're talking about affordability. Is this something that is just going to be inevitable in a city with the size and the scope and the scale of Toronto, that government simply needs to come in and mitigate and maybe soften a little bit? Or is this a structural issue that government and our whole society needs to correct from the bottom level, that affordability is not just the result of where we are, but is something much more structural? Who wants to take a stab at that one? Blair, you've got a big smile on your face.
Well, I do think that there's a role for government in this. But to answer your question, I think to some degree it is a result of living in a larger city, but I think that issue is compounded by things like our government, policy regimes, the organizational structure of our built form, and how those two things sort of coexist with one another. So I do a lot of work at sort of the neighborhood scale. And in Toronto, one of the things, I guess this is just my perspective, but we recently went through a process of reviewing and updating our official plan land use policies for the cities, all of the city's neighborhoods, which comprise 75% of the physical area of the city. And we call this the quote-unquote yellow belt. And the policies at the official plan level, which is the sort of big governing visioning document for the city in terms of policy regulations, was already sort of generally kind of on the prescriptive side in terms of what you could and couldn't do at the neighborhood scale. We've just gone through this process of reviewing and amending these policies, and I'm afraid that the outcome of that process is that we have even more stringent policies in place. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to build something that's slightly different from your neighboring properties and the properties that surround them in a neighborhood. So if you've got a neighborhood that's primarily detached single-family dwellings, it's becoming increasingly difficult to build something like, say, a triplex in a neighborhood. Even though from a physical form perspective, we're talking about, both buildings could be 2 to 3 stories. Both buildings could look like a detached single-family dwelling from the outside, but the way that our policies are written, it's being used as an argument from, parties like residents associations, ratepayers groups, even the city, in a lot of cases, to sort of put a stop to things that are, in their perspective, distinct from the prevailing neighborhood character, even though they may be very compatible, and even though they may be able to coexist in harmony, and even though they may even be designed and through, even though issues can be mitigated through design, to make them appear as though they're more consistent with the prevailing neighborhood character, we now have policies in place that are making that increasingly difficult. And that's constraining supply of housing. That's constraining the diversification of the housing that we have in our neighborhoods. Toronto is physically built out. So, any growth that we have is through intensification. And the way that our policies are structured, we're directing pretty much all that growth to the downtown, a few different centers like North York, Yonge and Eglinton, Scarborough Centre, Etobicoke Centre, a number of corridors which we call avenues. So like Yonge Street is an avenue, Queen Street is an avenue, for instance. And we're directing, high intensity development towards the centers in the downtown. So mid to high rise development. We're directing low to mid rise development along the corridors of the avenues. And we're basically saying that the neighborhoods, which is like almost everything else in the city, is off limits. And that they're physically stable, and that they're not anticipated to accommodate intensification. But what the problem is that the way the policies are written, we're finding it's quite difficult to actually just to build infill, and not even when it's directly the intent to intensify a neighborhood. Just when we want to build something different, we want to rebuild on a site in a slightly different form, and it's out of the character. And maybe it does result in an increased population. But from a physical form perspective, it's very similar. From a use perspective and a building typology perspective, it's slightly different. And we're running up against a lot of pushback from a lot of different parties on a site-by-site and an application-by-application basis. And the risk in all of that is, and this is over, the last 5-10 years, the city has grown significantly. Like over the last 20 years, I think the city of Toronto has grown by almost 500,000 people. And over that same time, a lot of our established neighborhoods have actually declined in population by like a factor of 200 to 250,000 people. The demographic composition of our households is changing. So the houses that had 5 people and a family living in them a generation ago now have empty nesters in them. But they're stuck in a house and they're afraid to sell because they don't have an accessible ground-related housing option in their neighborhood. They have to leave. They have to go somewhere else. And, they're constraining the supply of housing for young families and professionals and couples that want to come in and desperately want to get into that market. And so that's driving up the cost of housing.
Right.
Well, and I think, when I think about hard conversations we need to have with ourselves in Toronto, I think one of the questions we need to confront is who bears the weight of change in the city? If you can't embrace change, you should not live in the city. Toronto's whole narrative is we are a city in rapid flux and change. And so if you're change averse, this is the wrong place to live. But not everybody has to embrace the change in the same way. And I find that really hard as a planner because, we are economically more vibrant because new people come. People come from other countries and look after children. People come from other places and take up work. People come from other countries and make this city a rich, amazing place to live. And people move from other parts of Canada and come and live here too. But the places where those people are created opportunities to live are limited and narrow exactly for the reasons that you've suggested. And so I think this idea that we're directing the bulk of change to particular places makes sense in one level because we want people to live close to transit nodes, but I think we all need to accept change and embrace change, not just the transit nodes and the avenues and the corridors, right? So
Yeah, and I think the other issue is that even though we can accommodate growth in those areas, people still want to have access to ground-related housing, right? We're building. There's a mismatch between what the market is demanding and what we're building, and that's also partly driving up the cost of housing in Toronto.
How much of that, do you think, is that, if you think about other cities around the world, like you talked about London and Paris earlier, they have a much longer history of living in a different way. But one of the reasons why, in New York or London or Paris, you're willing to accept a smaller place to live is because the quality of life in public spaces is better. There's more public space. It's higher quality. There are other things to do outside your house. Like with ground-related housing, like people have movie theaters in their basements. They've taken the park and put it in their backyard, right? We've privatized public things because we've had the space to do it. But in other cities, because the space hasn't been there, they've invested more in public assets, which makes living in a smaller place work, right? You don't need a chef-size industrial kitchen in New York because you've got a city full of restaurants, whether or not you can afford to eat in them. Is the thing. But, there's this interesting tension between how much do you need at home versus how much can you live in public, I think, in part. And we're a bit chicken and egg stuck here, I think, because we grew up one way, but our population growth and change is leading us towards maybe needing to start to think about new ways of living in a different way, which doesn't include necessarily having ground-related housing.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the problem that we're going to have is that there's always going to be people that can afford to buy the Moore Parks and the Rosedales and, where there's a 50, 60-foot lot by, 180, and they come in and say, I'm 8 minutes from downtown or my job, and I'll pay $5 or $6 million for that. And so how do you stop that from happening? That's my big question, because I do see it. I see an elderly man or woman that's been in the house for 60 years and, they finally pass and it's an estate sale. But then, along comes a builder or, a family that says, okay, well, I'm buying up this lot now for X amount and rebuilding it. And now they've got an estate, which is 10 minutes from downtown. I don't know how many cities have that this close to the core. I mean, is that something that can ever be stopped? I don't think so. That's why we're almost seeing that price gap growing for large lots in the city. It's if you looked at a chart, it kind of goes, it's really high for little houses, kind of slumps a little bit for, $1 million to $2 million. And then for the big lots, it's, price per square foot, it kind of skyrockets again. And the way I see it anyways, because they're just so far and few between. Like how many lots are, 5,000 square feet or 8,000 square feet in the downtown core? People, especially, this young tech community that we're seeing now coming to the city, that are snapping these up. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, people used to talk about the financial industry and hedge funds, but now it's all these young tech guys that are buying up these big lots, nice lots.
I think I'm more concerned as a planner with how do we make sure that people who live in neighborhoods like Jameson Avenue and Parkdale or who live in Thorncliffe or Park or who live in Rexdale have access to high quality housing that's affordable with good access to public space and good access to school and good transit mobility. So I think we could focus a lot of energy on large lots for a small number of people, but I really think part of the challenge in Toronto is figuring out how to deliver a better quality of life for a wider range of people in a different part of the income spectrum. So, and I think, I'll come back to the work that your firm's doing on the mobility hubs. I mean, there's great hope in those spaces because government owns the land, right?
That's true.
And so if we can figure out how to capture the value of that land in a way that we can reinvest in public infrastructure, for example, we have a lot of hard work to do. But I do have hope on the mobility hubs front because government's an active partner in there and they get to control things in a different way than they would if it was trying to negotiate only with a private landowner.
One of the questions that came up earlier in this conversation that I think is really important to remind us of is who bears the weight of change in a city? Coming up in this conversation, we ask that question in many different ways, and we ask finally, how do we make our assets work harder in older cities? Not that Toronto is particularly old, but how do we make the things we've already built work harder for us so that the burden of change is not so heavy on those who bear it already? All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. There's so much that's been said already that I would love to continue with, so I'll just pick one thing, and it's this idea of different people in the city for different reasons, right? So one thing that's been mentioned is people come to Toronto because they're attracted to the parks or the quality of life. Even the drinking water, right, is an effect for some people why they move to a certain place. The schools, the education system, the access to arts and entertainment, or simply to be able to get out of town into the mountains in 20 minutes. That's something of value to some people in some cities. But there's also this other factor that's driving people to cities for, let's say, just darker reasons, whether it's employment or that's the only place I can get a job. I mean, I'm currently living in Kingston. There's not many retail jobs in Kingston. I'm walking down Yonge Street today, and every single shop has a sign that says we're now hiring. There seems to be a labor crunch just maybe on that street, but there's got to be dozens of jobs that were open today when I'm walking down there. And just to go back to this wider scale, up until I think 1850 or so, the city all around the world killed more people than it created, right? And so you had cities that were growing and growing exponentially. London went from 1 million people to 6 million people from 1800 to 1900. In 100 years, it times 6 in size. And all of those people, or most of those people, came from elsewhere. They weren't born in London, right? Today, we obviously have cities that have sanitation. We have a higher quality of life. People are born in cities, and cities are growing unto themselves. But there's a whole chunk of people who feel, I don't want to say that they're imprisoned. They can leave at any time. We don't live in, what's that movie, Escape from New York, where New York City becomes literally a prison. But there are a lot of people who live here who are not here because of the attraction of parks and things like that. So what is our responsibility, whether as planners, whether in real estate or in government, to understand that cities are really, they're our civilization. They're a microcosm of all people. Without getting too socialistic about it, what do we do when faced with this reality? I open it to the table.
We could explore inclusionary zoning policies.
I think you should.
What is that? What is inclusionary zoning policies?
I am not an expert.
Go ahead, Blair.
At a high level, I think the idea is that we're creating, through regulation of land use, we're creating a set of policies that incentivize and encourage, alternative forms of housing. Does that seem accurate, Pamela?
Yeah, I think we're trying to find new ways to mix the use of money with the delivery of a wider range of housing outcomes, among other things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what will that mean? What could that lead to in 20 years?
I think it's one tool of many that we're trying to throw at this persistent challenge of the city is no longer affordable for a wide range of people. I mean, that's, I had this conversation with some students the other day, which is if you had to pick one issue and fix it that would have the most impact, what would it be? And, you could argue that either focusing on mobility or affordable housing, if you can crack that and figure out how to make people move better through the city and or also have an affordable place to live, you would solve a lot of problems. Because at the end of the day, a city is only as good as the quality of life for its poorest citizens, I would argue. And if we, are a city tailored to the needs and wants of the people at the top of the economic food chain and everyone else is in service to and being left behind, we're not doing our job. So what's the role of government? I would say the role of government is to try to deliver better quality of life outcomes for as many people as possible. And we have to do better because the gap between those who are living well and those who are struggling continues to expand in Toronto. And it's unsustainable and it's unethical. And so we have to find, cities are great constellations of really smart people. We need to actually stop talking about it and make it happen. And that's easier said than done. But we have to do this or Toronto is going to implode on itself, I think.
That's right.
There's an underlying concept here, which is the need or the want to own property in a city, which is maybe a more North American idea. There are many cities in the world where rent is not only very normal, but very much a majority of people in the city rent as opposed to own. But, I don't want to say that this is a problem that we need to solve. I just want to ask, what is the role of ownership of property in a city? And is that something we need to question philosophically, practically? Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's this general sense of entitlement across the board. I mean, you can talk to anybody young or old and they feel like sort of thing, it's the American Canadian dream, let's own a property. But all you have to do is look at New York or London and see that it's not a right to own real estate. And, I think that people are starting to get smarter about that too. I see a lot of the the young people coming up wanting to own real estate, but not for living purposes. They're okay with renting, but they're buying it for investment purposes. They're buying a triplex and they're renting out the whole thing and they're staying in their $1,400 bachelor suite. So they're maybe getting a little bit smarter, but I do think that we're going to move towards a city where it's just going to be impossible for, people to even buy a small condo. I think that's unless there's some type of government intervention. But I do think that people need to accept the fact that maybe it's not going to happen. And if they do really desire to own a property, may not be in Toronto. It might be in Kingston, or it might be outside of the city.
You just mentioned the idea of someone owning a triplex and living in a $1,400 kitchen sink, for example.
Yeah.
Is that inherently disruptive to living in a city, or is that okay if that becomes the norm? I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying, what does that mean? If I own somewhere that I don't live and that becomes normalized, what does that mean going forward?
Well, I think what you're seeing, the funny thing is that we see that a lot because people are moving, but they're not selling. They're keeping their existing property, and that's compounding the problem, in general. So it's already become normal in this city where, it's how many condos do you own, or how many, what are you buying next, and along those corridors that we've talked about already, and so. I'm not sure the impact of it long term. I just know that we do need to address it for sure, and I think the people need to address their mental.
It's interesting when I talk to the students that I teach. Most of them don't have any even faint hope of owning anything over time. I mean, their goal is to find a secure, stable place to work and a decent place to live. And ownership is beyond. I mean, we talk about this a lot in planning school. A lot of them don't think they're ever going to own a house, and so I'm not sure. I think the American dream of owning something may be. It may be dated in a city like ours, and certainly with the kinds of young people that I'm teaching, it's not even a dream. They're trying to think about other more pragmatic things. So it's an interesting divide, I think. And I think people are open to all kinds of opportunities to live in good places. So I'm not so sure it's so much about ownership anymore. It's really about affordability and location. And also how where they live relates to where they work. And, we have this model of real estate that assumes that people are going to stay in one place for a long time because they're going to work in a place for a long period of time. And what we're seeing is a very dynamic workforce where people are working transiently or on shorter contracts, and where you live may be quite disconnected from where you work because it's impossible to tie the two of them together. And so that's a really interesting challenge for planners, I think. And that speaks, I think, even more to making sure that we're building good quality, affordable places to live that are well connected to the transit network, because you're going to have to change the location of your work many, many times.
And as a result, people are looking for places to live that offer a certain quality of life, a certain kind of experience and lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that they're not going to be working in the same place for their entire career.
Yeah, and so home becomes an anchor, but it also needs to be connected because you have to be able to still get to where you need to go. We did a study at Ryerson, colleagues of mine, Rakti Mitra and Maddie Simitiki at U of T, where it was called Student Move Toronto, where Ryerson, OCAD, York, and U of T had faculty members studying the commuting patterns of our students. And it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody who works inside a university, but students commute as far as 2 or 2.5 hours a day just to get to campus. And so what we're seeing is students are choosing their courses not based on what they want to take, but on maximizing their GO Train fare, for example, so that, they'll come and put in a 12-hour day so that they don't have to do it 2 more times a week to save $35 to $40 a week. And so that's a very different dynamic than what people might have imagined 25 years ago. But people commute incredibly long distances using more than one transit service provider or a mix of car and subway and GO Train. I mean, the mixes are tremendous, but people have very complicated lives getting from where they live to where they need to go, either for work or home or
Adam.
school.
I actually have a question for the everyone at the table about the King Street pilot project, which was basically eliminating all cars along King Street from I guess it was from Jarvis all the way over to Bathurst, and what their thoughts are on the success of it. Because my office is on that stretch, so I know from a retail perspective about how it's impacted me. But I'd like to get their inputs. And will that happen more as the city grows?
Blair.
Well, I'm not a transportation planner, so I'll preface my response with that. I am a user of the King Street Pilot Project on a daily basis to get to and from my home, which Adam kindly helped me secure in Leslieville a few years ago. And for me, I'm finding that it's making a fairly significant difference in how long it actually takes me to get to work. And I'm near the edge of the pilot project area. My office is at Jarvis, just a block away from Adams, and Adelaide. And I'm finding just even that small distance of not being stuck in mixed traffic on a block by block basis is making a tremendous difference for me. I'm also, as a pedestrian, finding it a lot easier to get across King Street at all hours of the day, and I go back and forth periodically. I grab lunch, down on King Street. I'll go to the market, and I'm finding it a lot quieter. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing from a retail perspective. Perhaps Adam can weigh in on that. But I'm finding it's more conducive to pedestrian activity in terms of being able to cross. And a lot of people jaywalk, and they're jaywalking anyway. But people, I get the sense people feel like it's a lot easier just to sort of navigate that. I am seeing some issues on the enforcement side, though, like a lot of vehicles going through the intersection and not a lot of actual enforcement of that.
So I think, the King Street Pilot Project is a really good example of an answer to the question about what's it going to take to make the city work the way we need to do it. And it was bold, and it was ambitious, and it was contentious. But it's that kind of fundamental rethinking about the assets that we have and how do we make them work well for as many people as possible. It's a central city building question in Toronto right now.
Yeah.
We have limited space. We have growing people. We're not able to create new roads or new rights of ways or other things. And so we have to make the assets we have work harder. And I would say that pilot project is an example of that. It's interesting, as a person who also cycles, it's magic now to cycle along that. And the interesting thing when they designed it was that the cycling community was unhappy because cyclists weren't considered into it. But by removing cars who are moving all the way through it, instead of limiting cars to just being able, you could drive a block and turn, basically, is the option that you have. It makes it work for cyclists, pedestrians, and transit riders. Individual car drivers may find it frustrating, but this is a collective versus individual good tension. And that's the reality of life in a city, which is who is your constituency and who is your audience. And in the city, it's the many rather than the individuals, I think, that you have to play for.
And there are other alternatives for vehicular, sort of travel nearby. I mean, Richmond Street and Adelaide Street are one-way streets in opposing directions, and they're designed for ease of vehicular traffic travel, right?
Yep.
So,
Adam, how is it affecting your business?
It's funny. We have the actual streetcar stop was moved right in front of our office, so it was actually a good thing. So now people are like standing there looking at our properties. But No, it hasn't affected it too much. I have heard reports that it has helped some restaurants and things like that, just for walkability and people, especially because we're around the St. Lawrence Market and there's a lot of walking going on there. But I do find that the single family car is on its way out in the downtown core. Like, I just don't think there's a need for it. And you see a lot of, one-person drivers, on a day-to-day basis, and if there's a way to like sort of park everybody on the outskirts of the city, of the downtown core, and leave their car there, even if they have to commute in here, it makes a lot more sense. And putting them into these big buildings and congesting the downtown core. But I think it was great. I think it worked really well, and I would hate to see it go. In fact, I think they should expand it right across King and get more people riding the streetcar. Now, when I need to get from one side of the city to the other side, I hop on the streetcar and I'm there in 2 minutes. I don't have to worry about traffic, and I don't worry about cars. I have meetings all the time on this side of the city, and it's great.
So I'm going to ask a question that is going to require your imagination and speculation. So prepare your crystal balls as I set this up. So a few minutes ago, we were talking about two different realities, one seeming to be opposed to the other. There was one reality of people who have lots of money or some means to be able to buy properties, some of them buying more than one, some of them owning a triplex, living in the $1,400 kitchen sink, and there are many cities in the world, like Tokyo, for example, where people live in tiny, tiny little homes, and they use a public bath to do their showering and to do their cleaning. And they, of course, you go to a ramen place for food. They don't cook at home because it's too small. This pressure to become smaller and smaller, but what you're having in Toronto is that you have people who might live in a small place but own 3 condos and make money off of them. So there's this reality. And there's the other reality of what you were talking about, Pamela, is the many versus the individual, this really interesting tension, and that there's lots of people now who just accept they will never own a home, that they will spend the rest of their lives in Toronto and never own a piece of property, and that's okay. That's their lives, and there's some sense that the city needs to be catered to them. My question is, if we accept that these two realities exist, and that in 30 years or 50 years, they will not only continue to exist, but bifurcate even further, so that there are essentially two different groups of people living in Toronto that have very little to do with one another, which goes in hand with the increasing polarization of our politics, the increasing polarization of our culture. It's very easy, if I know something about what you believe, I might be able to determine everything else you believe as well. Now that sounds like BS, but it's becoming more and more true as we enter into our echo chambers of social media. So my question is that in 30 years, if these two realities continue to exist side by side, what will our city and cities around the world look like? And we can take into account technology and autonomous vehicles, other changes in development. What could cities look like as a result?
Well, I think in a weird way, it's a bit of a false dichotomy, because I think the necessity right now is to double down on throwing all of our capital, human and creative and real capital, at trying to make the city as livable as possible for as many people as possible. Like, that's where I think all the energy should go. Because if you focus on planning an awesome city for the elites, you're going to leave behind a whole bunch of people. But if you make the city as good as possible for as many people as possible, there'll be a ripple effect that benefits more people. And so I'm gonna go with the focus on trying to deal with as many people well as possible, but stop talking about it and actually figure out how to do it and walk the talk. Not just, no more like, oh, we'll do it. You can't keep punting it down the road. It's time to do it now. Toronto really has to confront that we need to make the city more livable. And if we don't, we're not going to have much of a city left.
But that's my question. So let's just say we don't. What could Toronto or any other city look like?
Are you familiar with David Halchansky's mapping of the 3 Torontos?
No.
So for the listeners, this might be something to check out.
Yeah.
So David Halchansky's taken a look at sort of the low, middle, and high income earning brackets across the city over a period of time, and how land values have changed and how affordability has changed throughout the city over a course of several decades. And he's now sort of taken that logic and projected into the future, looking, if we assume, I'm not doing this justice, but if we assume, these sort of trends continue into the future, what are we moving towards? So if we back up and we look sort of like 30 years in the past, we had a massive middle class in Toronto. We had, the vast majority of the geographic area of the city sort of being dominated by the middle class. We had slightly less, lower income area in the downtown and slightly higher income areas, sort of key locations in the outer suburbs along Transit and along Yonge Street. The middle class has eroded away quite significantly today. It's much smaller than it was 20, 30 years ago. A lot of wealth has come into the downtown and to the inner neighborhoods, sort of the more established, the Leslievilles, the Roncesvalles of Toronto, the Rosedales, right? The Yonge Line corridor, the subway corridors in general are becoming increasingly wealthy, and the inner suburbs of the GTA that fall within the city of Toronto's boundaries of, a lot of Scarborough, a lot of the north end of Etobicoke are becoming increasingly impoverished and are now sort of falling below the average sort of median household income range. Projecting forward 20 years in the future, that is only anticipated to become exacerbated if we don't do something quite significant, as Pamela is saying. And so we're going to see the sort of the complete erosion at some point of the middle class and massive wealth polarization. So massive concentration of wealth in the downtown and the centers along the corridors, and massive impoverished areas in areas of Scarborough and northern Etobicoke especially.
Adam, before we get to you, do you think that this could result in, say, gated communities? I mean, this is something I don't know how much we have of this in Canada, but I've seen it in the States, and it's always shocked me as to just how inhuman it seems to have gated communities. But do you think that that could be a result of where people just essentially hermit into their little corners, right?
Yeah, I mean, safety definitely comes up, especially in the upper tier sort of neighborhoods in the city, and you're seeing, I'm personally seeing, home security systems increase a lot in these homes that we're going to. So I do believe that, that could happen down the road, and I'm sort of seeing that polarization even more. But going back to your original question, I think that people are going to literally work in the building that they live in. And I'm seeing that now. It's people want to buy when they're part of the underground path, which is an underground pathway along the financial core of the city. So if the condo's not connected to that, they're not buying that condo. And I think what is happening down at Google and along the Portlands, I think that's going to be a really great example of a future city and what's happening. Because what I see a lot now is that these developers are coming in and they're building 3 to 10 buildings in a little section of Toronto, and they're not getting that neighborhood vibe, and they're not getting that so they're kind of sheltered and they're on their own, and maybe they have their grocery store, but that's sort of it, and they don't have that sense of community, say Corktown or King East or whatever, name it. And I feel like Sidewalk Labs is really considering that, and I think that I'm really excited to see what they come up with and sort of what's pushed back by the city, and because I really do think that people are just going to say, especially, everybody's seen the population numbers, the projections for Toronto and what Toronto's going to grow to over the next, say, 50 years, and nobody's going to want to commute down here. No one's going to want to have a car. So coming in from Markham won't even be an option. And so you could see, people that can work from home will work from home because they have to, and that'll be it. And then the people that are sort of in that spectrum where they can get a great job and live in the city and pay for it will live here. And I think that lends to what Blair was just saying.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought that it seems like we're maybe going to start living vertically. So if I live in the same building that I work in, I can have all the packages delivered to my door of everything that I need, and my grocery store is maybe just across the street. And anywhere that I go, I can probably get in my car and go out to, the Muskokas or something if I'm living in Toronto. It seems that my life is becoming more and more contained to this vertical stack, which, what does that mean for the city? My conception of the city is something that's quite horizontal. It's quite the streetscape, and I can walk 20 minutes to the park and move around that way, or bike, or get in my car. But if I'm more and more constricted, that seems to me a city that we've never lived in before, a city we've never built before that we may be building now.
But the reality is, a bunch of people aren't going to live that life, because part of living a city involves having access to services, whether they're public services or they're commercial services, and people are still going to do those jobs. There'll still be people who teach our children. There'll be still people who look after older people. A good chunk of our economy is based on service provision, and that's not going to be localized at home. And so I think we have to be careful about thinking only about the privileged people who have good enough work that they can afford that quality of life, when the city functions based on a whole bunch of work, a lot of which will never be working from home. And so I just have to throw that in there, that we can't forget about everyone else in the city who works on our transit system and who teaches at our schools and works at our healthcare facilities, because those people need high quality of life as well.
Precisely, and I think that's you've kind of hit the nail on the head, Pamela, because what I'm getting at is that some people might be in A, and then you have other people in B. And what happens when they get further?
Well,
and
that's
further
already
apart?
happening. I mean, Holchansky's work shows that, but other research too shows that people who work in service sector jobs are commuting very, very far to come into the city to do their work, and so other bigger cities are struggling with those kinds of inequities. There are things around like basic incomes or a different kind of living minimum wage that's geared more towards the cost of living rather than just what a national standard would be, recognizing in cities like San Francisco, for example, it's crazy expensive to live there. And so they've changed the minimum wage structure to try to make it more affordable, although they're still continuing to struggle and buckle. So this is a persistent challenge, but not one that we can shy away from.
This issue of the death of distance and this idea of, not requiring being in the city at any given time, and we can live more remotely, we can operate remotely, and we don't need to travel anymore. This is an idea that isn't new. It's not something that sort of was invented post internet. This is something that Marshall McLuhan was talking about a century ago, and it's been raised time and time again, and it's brought up at key sort of technological milestones like the advent of the internet and the advent of autonomous vehicles. It hasn't happened to the full extent anyway that it's been that had been anticipated. I think in a lot of ways the opposite has actually happened in a lot of cities. In fact, we started off this conversation saying, a generation ago people were leaving Toronto, and now look at us. It's not the same city that I moved to in 2003. It's a completely different place,
right?
And it's multi-centric. It's a city, as Adam says, a city of many different villages or neighborhoods. It's a city that has many different urban centers and several downtowns, and very large employment districts. I mean, we don't think of this every day, but the Pearson Employment District is the second largest economic hub in the entire country next to downtown Toronto. And it's a low-rise district primarily, but a massive amount of economic activity comes out of there. One of the biggest problems I think that we have is that our transit system, both GO and TTC, and generally our regional infrastructure, broadly speaking, is centered around a couple of major centers, but the reality is that people's commuting patterns are not to and from the downtown necessarily. There are a lot of jobs coming to the downtown. The downtown's becoming increasingly vibrant, but we're also a multinodal city. It's multicentric, and we have people commuting to from Scarborough to the airport lands. And one of the biggest issues we have, and this ties into the affordability argument, is that we don't have the infrastructure to support their commuting patterns, and so people are having to take multiple different means of getting to and from their job every day. That's eating into their time with their family, and that's eating into their disposable income. It maybe is a determining factor in whether or not they go after a job in a certain area or a job at all, because they may be in a relatively isolated location without access to transit that supports their particular commuting patterns, and that's something that's starting to change now. Finally, we're bringing on a regional express rail network, the GO lines, right? We're bringing in cross-town lines on Eglinton and then Dundas and Mississauga. We're bringing in sort of cross-city connective surface and segregated rapid transit routes, but we have a long way to go to create like a truly integrated transit network. And I think that's one of the biggest things that, looking out 30 years in advance, that's one of the biggest fears I have, is that we fail to act on the opportunity and the necessity to build that infrastructure now, because we needed it yesterday. We needed it 10, 15 years ago. We were really good at building transit infrastructure up until, say, the 80s, and then we stopped building it, for a number of decades, and now we're desperately trying to play catch up. And the city continues to grow. We have virtually no control over how many people come to Toronto every year. We're trying to regulate where they can go within the city once they arrive here, but we're continuing to grow, and unless we act and we provide, transportation infrastructure, and unless we act and we incentivize inclusionary zoning and we build purpose-built rental and we try our best to accommodate, the greatest variety of people and not just the elites, we're going to have, we're going to suffer for that in the long term, and we will all suffer. The people that remain here will suffer as well.
So everybody at the table seems to be champing at the bit to jump in, and there's an electricity in it, and unfortunately we have to end. But I have one final question in which you can get your final point in. So if there was one thing that you could still talk about in this conversation, or if we could have another conversation and you'd want to get this point across, or a subject that we haven't addressed yet in this conversation, what would that be? So for me, for example, we've really tackled public transportation, we've tackled affordability, we've tackled this sort of the polarization that's occurring in the city. One thing that I'd like to probably address further is the future of work in the city. What does it mean? What are the jobs going to look like in the city? And are they city dependent, as many jobs today are? But what's something that you wish we had discussed, or a subject or an area or a point that you wish we'd delved into further? Quickly, in like just a minute or so. Pamela.
I think my question would be, are there new creative ways for private sector developers to work with government to actually deliver the kinds of affordable housing outcomes we need? So we talk a lot about public-private partnership and building infrastructure, but is there a new way to think about that? Because I think these problems are bigger than just government or just the private sector or just civil society groups. And so is there a new way of working and thinking that we need to really start to get our heads around to actually deliver what a livable, inclusive city looks like? That would be my question.
Excellent. Adam.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think it would be about really eliminating the buyers that are not from sort of Canada. I think what Australia's done is done amazing with sort of curbing this problem. And I think if Toronto adopted that, it would be helpful, just because from a supply-demand perspective. And, what are some other ways that we can, help people that actually live and work here buy or rent here, rather than, outsiders type thing.
Yeah.
I think that's helpful.
I've got a couple things. I think one of the big things, and this sort of ties into the Sidewalk Labs discussion, is around data privacy. Who owns that information? How is it managed? How is it collected? Furthermore, what is the role of large corporations like Google coming into a city, and what role should they play in city building? I think that's a huge question that we need to address. The last thing I'd say is generally we need to start talking a little bit more about the role of urban resiliency and the place that it has in our comprehensive planning for future development. And it's not something that's getting the traction I think that it requires. It's something that I'm cautiously optimistic is something that we're going to sort of start addressing more and more as we move forward. But how do we respond to chronic stresses and shocks to our system, whether they be the closure of a piece of infrastructure, or flash flooding, or
right.
The indirect effects of climate change? How do we address some of these chronic social issues, housing issues that we have in Toronto? But all these things together, how do we build inherent redundancies into our infrastructure to account for these things?
Another thing to be resilient to is like job loss, for example, with the closing of the GM plant in Oshawa, for example. There may be more shocks like this to come, and how can a city as a whole be resilient to that? Blair, Adam, Pamela, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really great.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.
To learn more about Blair Scorgie, Adam Brind, and Pamela Robinson, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me. Now, your quote of the week is from Italo Calvino. He says that the city, however, does not tell its past, but contains it, like the lines of a hand. Special thanks for this episode to Blair Scorgie for helping me put this panel together, and of course to Pamela Robinson for giving us the space at Ryerson University. And thanks as always to our composer, Andrea Wetstein, for this wonderful music. Next week we're talking about the book Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman with guest Mark Solis. I'll see you then.